3:15 p.m. After school, I was waiting by the bus to meet Daisy when I saw Erwin on his bicycle. He always biked back and forth to school. Is Daisy still coming over? He asked. I didn't answer. What? He said. You're still mad? Take back what you said about my blotch, about me being ugly. Erwin just stood there. I shook my head. Forget it. He looked like he really wanted to take it back, but for some reason he couldn't. Instead, he biked away. Hey, yelled a voice, and I turned around. There was Daisy coming out of the school with two girls, Mara Lloyd and Lila Egan. They started heading over to me. Uh-oh. This was it. The part where Daisy realizes there are way more popular people to be hanging around with than Swimmy Jimmy. Okay, well, see you later, Daisy said. I tried to act cool. So you're not coming over after all? Daisy's face scrunched up in confusion. Of course I'm coming over, silly, she said. She pointed at the girls. I'm saying goodbye to them. Oh, I said, I knew that. What are we going to do at your house? She asked. We're going to try and train Abby, right? Yep, I said. I was just about to add. And also I thought maybe we'd watch an episode or two of Stop Police. When I pictured Erwin rolling his eyes, and I decided not to. We'll figure out some other fun stuff to do too, I said. Instead. Daisy smiled. Sounds great. I saw Erwin in the distance, watching us from his bike, and suddenly I felt guilty. I was about to call out to him to meet us at my house, but for some reason I didn't. Maybe Erwin was right. Maybe I wanted Daisy for myself, after all. 3:42 p.m. When we got home, Mrs. Craig was in the kitchen making after-school snacks. Stay away from the kitchen if you want to live, I whispered to Daisy. Hello there, Mrs. Craig sang, just as friendly as can be. Then she spotted Daisy, and her smile faded for a split second. Daisy smiled shyly. I'm Daisy. I live across the street. Hello, young lady, Mrs. Craig said. It's nice to meet you. Then she looked at me. Your parents didn't say anything about a friend coming over. Have you forgotten that we're going out? No, I remember, I said, but Daisy and I thought that instead we could stay here and train Abby to be better behaved. I see, Mrs. Craig thought for a second. Well, your parents asked us to go to the park, so we should do that. Daisy, you're welcome to come, but I don't feel comfortable taking Abby in my car. You can play with her when you get home. I thought about it for a second, then decided not to make a big deal out of it. I had to make this work with Mrs. Craig. Fine, I said, but let me just go say hi. Quickly, said Mrs. Craig. We ran up to my room where Abby was sleeping in the closet. Oh, she's so cute, squealed Daisy. I leaned down. Hey, girl. Abby woke up with a wag and licked my nose. I'll be back in a little while. Shouldn't we take her out to go to the bathroom? Daisy asked. Of course we should, I said, embarrassed that I didn't think of it first. I grabbed the leash and we headed outside. Abby blinked her eyes at the sunlight, as usual. She quickly did her business and then pulled the leash toward the spot under the house where she liked to hang out. Not today, Ab, I said. I need to go out for a little while, but we'll be back soon. Your babysitter doesn't seem so bad, Daisy said to me, as we walked Abby back to the house. Actually, she seems really nice. I know, I said. Something's different today. Mrs. Craig was waiting in the car. Hurry, children, she called. We don't want to miss the best part of the day. I'm going to sit in the back with Daisy, I told her. Mrs. Craig shook her head. Oh, please, she said sweetly. Sit up here with me. Okay. I opened the door and sat down next to her cane. Oh, shoot, Daisy said. I should check with my mom and make sure I can go out. For a second, I saw Mrs. Craig's eyes go dark, but then she smiled. Well, go ahead, my dear, she said to Daisy. Hurry along now. Daisy ran across the street to her house, leaving Mrs. Craig and me in the car. She seems like a very sweet young lady, Mrs. Craig said. She is. I paused, then said, I'm sorry that Abby and you aren't getting along. I really hope we can fix it. Mrs. Craig stared straight ahead. Well, Jimmy, thank you for saying that. And perhaps we might have been able to, indeed. What do you mean, might have? Well, I'm a little too old to be chasing a puppy around, she said. As it turns out, I've been offered a position at a nice home with no pets. She smiled at me. So today will be my last day as your babysitter. Oh, I said. I couldn't believe it. My dream was coming true. No more fried beets. So why did I feel a little weird? Daisy came back and gave the thumbs up. All set, she said, hopping in the back seat. We were just pulling into the street when I saw Mrs. Craig glance in the rearview mirror, and her mouth fell open wide. What on earth? I turned around and saw Abby sprinting down the driveway, heading right toward us. Abby, no, I said, but I was too late. She jumped through the open window and landed right on my lap. That dog is unbelievable, cried Mrs. Craig. I'm so sorry, Daisy said. I guess we didn't shut the front door all the way. Abby can open doors all by herself, I blurted out, which made Daisy look at me funny. Meanwhile, Abby was sitting there, happy as a clam, panting away. Can she come, Mrs. Craig, I begged. Can she please? I absolutely positively knew that Mrs. Craig would say no, until she said, fine. See, I told you, it was a crazy day. 3:58 p.m. The next weird thing that happened was that instead of going to Ambler's Green, which was the popular park downtown, we went to Nash's Swamp. What are we doing here? I asked. It's much less crowded, answered Mrs. Craig. This way, Abby can't attack any other dogs or people. That wouldn't happen, I said. Well, if it did, you know the dog would have to go back to the shelter, and I'm sure you wouldn't want that. No, he wouldn't, Daisy piped in. Mrs. Craig smiled at Daisy through the rear-view mirror. That's right, young lady. We pulled into an empty, long, abandoned parking lot. The only other things in it were weeds. I looked around. What are we supposed to do here? My, aren't we full of questions today, Mrs. Craig said. You're children. I'm sure you can figure out a way to have fun. Too bad we don't have a ball, Daisy said. We could have played fetch or something. Eventually, we found a stick and started throwing it to Abby. Instead of bringing it back, though, she wanted to be chased, so we started chasing her all over the park, until Daisy threw the stick back toward the car. Abby picked it up and ran up to Mrs. Craig, wagging her tail. Then she dropped the stick at Mrs. Craig's feet and waited. Throw it to her, I called. You can do it. Slowly, Mrs. Craig bent down, picked up the stick, and tossed it a few feet. It was kind of a pathetic throw, but Abby didn't care. She tore after it, picked it up, and threw it up in the air herself. Mrs. Craig laughed, and it seemed like a real, honest laugh. She really is quite cute, I must admit. Mrs. Craig bent down to pet Abby, and for a brief second I was almost sad that she wasn't going to be my babysitter anymore. Then we all heard the rumble of an engine. I saw Mrs. Craig's face change. I wasn't sure why, but it changed. 2 seconds later, a van turned into the lot. Who the heck is that? Daisy wondered. The van pulled up right next to us. On the side it read, Bradford's bestest babysitters. Trust your kids with the bestest, better than the restest. Huh? The door opened and out came a very tall, very large man. He was wearing the same blue and white striped shirt that Baxter Bradford always wore. He had a beard that made him look like a pirate, and he smelled like he'd just jumped in a lake of cologne. The man saw Mrs. Craig, smiled, and gave her a little peck on the cheek. Nice to see you, my dear, he said. My dear? Were they married or something? Then he walked over to me, pointed at my blotch, and said, Well, hey there, Swimmy Jimmy, you should fire your tattoo guy. That didn't come out so good. I felt my heart speed up. You should talk, I said back. You're not exactly the most handsome person I've ever seen. Mrs. Craig cleared her throat. Barnaby, please don't be rude. Then she turned to us. Children, this is Barnaby Bradford, my boss. Profile, Barnaby Bradford. Age, old enough to have warts on his fingers. Occupation, owner of a babysitting company. Interests, raising bullies.